Good afternoon. Welcome to our second day of Bard at Blount, the 2023 edition. This year's theme is the Folio at 400, the book that changed the world. We had a couple of cancellations for today, so we have some fill-in presentations, which I think are going to be amazing, and fill in some gaps that weren't necessarily touched on yesterday, but will make a lot more sense. So I am Dr. Kelly Rivers. I will be your first presenter today, and I'm going to be talking about what are words worth, specifically Shakespeare and his language. And to answer the question in the title, what are words worth, according to the latest auction figures for a recent edition of the First Folio, Shakespeare's words are worth $2.5 million. I wish we could all be so lucky. In 1998, scholar and critic Harold Bloom published Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. This text attempted to argue that much of what we know, think, and believe about ourselves as humans comes from our study of Shakespeare. Now, this thesis has been the topic of much debate since then, but whether or not this argument is actually true, what cannot be debated is the impact that Shakespeare has had on how we communicate in the world around us and understand the world around us. So, as Shakespeare himself says in Hamlet, to hold as it were a mirror up to nature. And this idea of if we look at ourselves, we understand the world. So, words. Up until about the last 15 years, estimates about the exact number of words that we owe to Shakespeare varied from an early figure of 15,000 words as claimed by a Victorian word expert. I'm not quite sure how you earned that title. F. Max Muller. He claimed 15,000 words originated in Shakespeare's works. As of the 1950 publication of the Oxford English Dictionary, their count was 3,200. As of today, after some study in 2011, that tally is accepted between 1,700 and 2,000. But still, that's 2,000 words that originated from one author over a course of just a couple of decades. And so, just for the record, the definition of a new word is often just the combination of existing terms or phrases, or anglicization, or I'm going to make up my own word today, Anglification, of words from foreign languages. That's basically you take a word in a foreign language and you give it a meaning in your own language. We see this going on in foreign language all the time, a give and take, a shifting and sharing of ideas. In 2014, two New York booksellers who specialize in rare and antique books claimed that they had found Shakespeare's dictionary, the text that he used to help develop and understand language. This dictionary, they were pleased to find, had personal annotations, and they talk about there are 4 different types of annotations that they discovered, but they found this text on eBay, of all places. I guess I need to up my eBay game. This text was a 1580 publication of John Burrett's The Alivary, or the Quadruple Dictionnaire. Fun fact, they only paid $4,050 for it. I think I might even be able to squeak that out if I teach summer school. In the image on the right, you'll see an excerpt from the dictionary for the words wedlock, up there, and smart, spelled, obviously, in their original 16th century fashion. The two booksellers, Koppelman and Winchler, they do identify 3 to 4 distinct types of annotations and note-taking in the margins and also at the end. They compiled and have published their findings in a text. It's now in its second edition, called Shakespeare's Beehive. An annotated Elizabethan dictionary comes to light. The three primary forms that they uncover were spoken annotations. This is where the author writes other words in the margins. And we can see that in the top example here, that under where it says shake, right above it in handwriting is shaft. That the author, whoever that might be, whether it's Shakespeare or someone else, added their own word to that. The second type would be a mute annotation. And there are two types of mutes, circles and dashes. So this is where the author was reading and circling, much like we tell our students how to annotate, circling or making dashes to call attention to particular words or sounds to put together. And the second type of mute annotation would be the favorite, underlining. They didn't have highlighters, so quill underlining works for me. And then the fourth, or the third rather, but I find the most fascinating is this trailing blank annotation. And this is where the author plays around, or whoever owned the book, plays around with mixing and matching words on a blank sheet of paper. So this would be very much like I tell my students, turn to the back of your notebook and start keeping a dictionary log list. This is the author picking words from the various dictionary sections and putting them together in his or her own handwriting. And so this page, trailing blank annotations. So if this book, this dictionary, turns out, in fact, to be Shakespeare's linguistic resource, what this tells us is that he was conscious about his diction, how the words sounded, how the words looked, whether that's for the purpose of poetic structure, for his iambic pentameter, for his prose, for his characters, or if it was just a way of capturing a mood, a feeling, or an image. But what we do know, what we can accept, is that nearly 2,000 words that we still use today originally appeared in a Shakespeare text in the 16th century. And they were first recorded in his text. For example, words like these: amazement, exposure, majestic, bedroom. Right? I always like to ask my students, where did you wake up this morning? Right? If not your bedroom, where? Right? Frugal, obscene, bump, generous, radiance, courtship, gloomy, critic, my favorite words, and road. Right? Again, these are probably words that were in the common spoken lexicon of the age, but in terms of being written down in a concrete recorded form, they first appear in Shakespeare. He's also known for his expressions, kind of like this one. Obviously, to be or not to be is a very famous one. Et tu, Brute, right? The ultimate form of betrayal. All the world's a stage. Hail Caesar, and then my favorite, holla. You know, we owe that to Shakespeare as well. One of the more famous ideas about, we all speak Shakespeare all the time, was captured in a poem by Bernard Levin called Quoting Shakespeare. And Dr. Horn has the poster version here. But I often, as I tell my students and myself, hearing it makes it more real for me. So I did find this clip. Oops, it's going to let me play it maybe? It's going to let me play it? Nope. Maybe not. Okay, I'll read it to you, because I have a backup. Okay? Apologize for all the words on the screen. If you cannot understand my argument and declare it's Greek to me, you're quoting Shakespeare. If you claim to be more sinned against than sinning, you're quoting Shakespeare. If you recall your salad days, you're quoting Shakespeare. If you act more in sorrow than in anger, if your wish is farther to the thought, if your lost property has vanished into thin air, you are quoting Shakespeare. If you've ever refused to budge an inch or suffered from green-eyed jealousy, if you've played fast and loose, if you've been tongue-tied, a tower of strength, hoodwinked, or in a pickle. If you've knitted your brows, made a virtue of necessity, insisted on fair play, slept not one wink, stood on ceremony, danced attendance on your lord and master, laughed yourself into stitches, had short shrift, cold comfort, or too much of a good thing. You've seen better days or lived in a fool's paradise. Why, be that as it may, the more fool you, for it is a foregone conclusion that you are, as good luck would have it, quoting Shakespeare. If you think it's early days and clear out bag and baggage, if you think it's high time and that is the long and short of it, if you believe that the game is up and that the truth will will out even if it involves your own flesh and blood, if you lie low till the crack of doom because you suspect foul play, if the truth were known, for surely you have a tongue in your head, you are quoting Shakespeare. If you bid me good riddance and send me packing, if you wish I was dead as a doornail, if you think I'm an eyesore, a laughingstock, a devil incarnate, a stony-hearted villain, bloody-minded or blinking idiot, then by Jove, oh Lord, tut, tut, for goodness sake, what the dickens? But me no buts. It is all one to me, for you are quoting Shakespeare. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jen Horn. I teach English here at Blount. And if you were around for yesterday, you've heard me talk a little bit. But I'm back here today with the option of talking more about printing the first folio. So yesterday we spoke about what the first folio is. For people who weren't there yesterday, it is the first big old book of Shakespeare's plays. A folio is a huge book. It's one where they printed out a single page, they folded it once. So you have one page, you open it up, you have two facing you, you close it, you have the fourth. And that is a big book. If you fold the paper again, you get a quarto size. If you fold it again, you get an octavo, and I'm going to show you what that looks like all spread out. But this is the first big book of Shakespeare's plays. Shakespeare's also the first one to have a big book like that, only of plays. Before then, it was more likely to be a Bible or a religious book or a philosophical treatise, and Shakespeare's the first one to have only plays. So today I want to talk about printing that. So here is one of the copies of the first folio. You're going to hear about a lot more of them from Professor Carl Wilcoxon today. But I want to get into how they were made. And it was in a print shop that looked just like this. You can see people at the fore having where they're going to put the paper over where all of the words are printed and get the ink on it and everything. But you also have people in the back who are scribbling things down, who are looking at other books. You have copies of the pages in front of them. What I want you to take away from this is there are a lot of stages to this process. We're not going to go into lots of detail about all of those stages. If you're worried, don't worry. But I want to go over some of the highlights with this. So the first one to know is that, well, you have to have somebody go through, figure out what is going to be in the book. You get someone who has enough knowledge to figure out how many words per page. So how many words you need to leave for the next part. And I love on the left-hand side of the page here, you're not using up the whole page because they weren't sure how much space it was going to take. So you give yourself plenty of room. If you have extra room, you have some pretty artwork. So keep that in mind. Now, to get to this, we have to have a copy. We have to go to a manuscript that somebody has written by hand, long before typewriters, long before computers, and if you're lucky, you are going to have beautiful handwriting. Anyone recognize this beautiful handwriting? I think if you look really closely in the bottom right-hand corner, you will see this is by a young Elizabeth I. I have had the, I'm going to say, good luck to study paleography of this period, study the handwriting and be able to read this. This is a dream come true. This is easy peasy. The same person, Elizabeth I, by the end of her reign, had handwriting that looked a little bit more like this. You can still read it, but it's a bit harder, yes? So what I want you to remember is when they're putting together this book of Shakespeare's plays, they're going with monographs, they're going with handwriting, and just like today, sometimes you can see clearly what it says. Sometimes it's more of a guess. And we're talking about William Shakespeare here. There is some question about whether or not he was the person who wrote these plays, but let's just put that aside for a second. The one piece of writing that we believe other than his will. So this handwriting has been checked with his signature on his will and on some other legal documents. The only version of any play that we have in that handwriting is this. One scene, one long speech from a play called Sir Thomas More that was so shocking that it was censored, which is the only reason that we have it. Someone kept a copy of this dangerous book on a shelf in the library and kept it closed, and no one bothered about it for centuries. So we have it because people wanted to keep it away. But if you try to read this, and here is a close-up, any words popping out at you? Again, I've taken classes in this. This one, it would probably take hours for me to come up with a few words here. So just take a moment and really think about the compositors at the print shop who have to figure out what this says. And not just this. Anyone remember from yesterday how many plays were in the first folio? I'm going to be really impressed. Dr. Rivers. Anyone else? Okay, Shakespeare Professional, how many? 36 plays in here. If you go see the plays now, they usually take like around 3 hours to watch. That's a lot of writing. That is a lot of handwriting to decipher. So keep this in mind. The more I think about this book, the more of a miracle it becomes to me that we still have this. And remember, 18 of those 36 plays we only have because of this book. No earlier version remains. So with this, they then, after they've deciphered the text, have to get these tiny little pieces of print together, every single letter, figure out whether it's lowercase, uppercase, put them all together. I apologize, this is upside down, but you also have to remember with printing, because you're going to put the paper over it and print that way, you have to do this backwards. So not only do you have to do 36 plays from the handwriting, you then have to pick these up letter by letter and backwards, while your boss is standing over there waiting for you to get this done. So again, it becomes more and more of a miracle to me that this happens. By the way, this is one of those big sheets of paper that you then fold several times. This is an octavo where you have 8 pages to one side of the page. You then flip it over and print on the other side of the page as well. But keep in mind, we're talking about a folio. So basically, this would have 2 pages on it. And in fact, here is a copy of the folio. So again, this is to make one side of one page. can you imagine all of this work? So it actually took from February of 1622 to November of 1623 to get this all done in small batches, one play at a time. And let's spare a thought for one person that we know about. His name is John Leeson, and bless his heart, John Leeson was employed at this printing shop in November of 1622. He signed up for a job where you have 7 years to learn your craft. 5 months into that, he is stuck being one of the main compositors for this book. And sadly, now many Shakespeare critics curse his name because of all the mistakes that he made. And they're trying to figure out what Shakespeare meant that Leeson got wrong, and how dare he. And I'm just impressed that he got any of this done at all, because how many more typos do I have when somebody is watching me work and when I'm on the clock? No autocorrect. So keep that in mind. And also with this, keep in mind that you start making prints of these once you get everything on that board. And, well, you do have bosses. They're going to be checking for errors. And so they're going to be over there reading. Remember that first picture? You have people in the background reading. They're going to try to find any errors, and as soon as you find one, you fix it. Are you going to go back and fix the earlier pages? Oh no. And we will talk a little bit later about why. You keep on going. So some pages are going to have tons of errors. Some will have like one fewer error. Then they'll find another one fewer error. And they keep on going. We think that there were between 700 and 750, most people will say 750 copies made of this play. And when I say no two of these are alike, I mean it. Because every single play, they were putting them in piles, but they weren't putting them in the same order. So one copy might have the first copy of The Tempest, the 73rd copy of As You Like It, the 298th copy of Trellis and Cressida. And this is why scholars now actually care about every single copy that they can find of the folio, because maybe it's got a different version of the proofing than we've seen anywhere else. So I mentioned before that you don't get a second chance. If it's printed, and that is because of the paper they printed on. This is paper that is made out of linen rags. That was common for the time period, but for a folio, this is a huge book. This is for your best customers. This is going to cost a whopping 15 shillings to get it unbound, 20 shillings to buy it bound, and that is 2 months' wages for a skilled worker in that time. 2 months' wages. So you have to have the best paper. And one of the craziest things about this to me is they actually couldn't find nice enough linen rag paper in England. They had to import it from France. But the fascinating thing about this is way back in the 1600s, and this is some linen rag paper here, some linen rags. They actually had recycling. You use the linen rags. They had a complex procedure for cleaning them, for preparing them to become paper, and then you recycled them into these books through complex methods. But I do find that interesting, so you are not wasting a single page. If it got printed, who cares how many mistakes there are? Although, we only do that if it's something we don't really care about, like plays. If it's something really important, they actually had laws where if you printed the Bible wrong, you could go to jail. But this is just plays, so that's okay. Don't worry about it. So with this, again, each copy is a little bit different. I like this picture of a folio. This one I talked about yesterday has been cut into 3 volumes. But in this photo, you can see a little bit of the page texture and see how it's a little bit different than our modern wood-based paper. So with this, again, we don't want to use or leave anything unused. So in this page, Not only do you have your lovely decoration for the end, I like that they had so much room left, they decided they were going to give us a list of characters too. So they're thinking like smart business people. We don't want to have lots of like plain white page. That just looks wasteful. So they throw that in. So overall, you get these completely different copies, which leads to a really fascinating thing that happens later on. And that is people decide to Frankenstein these things. They will take a really good copy, except it has a page or two that's not great, and they'll cut out that page from another copy and paste it in, as you can see from this one. So there are 235 copies of Shakespeare's folio that we have now, out of between 700 and 750. Out of those, only 56 are complete copies. So you hear about that difference in $2.2 million for one and $10 million for another because it is complete. So when you hear about really dramatically big differences in price, it has a lot to do with this. And it also means people start collecting. They want to see all of them. They want to see the best versions. They want to see the various versions. And that leads to collections like that of Henry Folger. All of these are copies of the first folio. If you were here yesterday, you've seen this picture before. And this leads directly into our next presentation from Professor Carr Wilcoxon about Henry Folger, the collector. Thanks.
Well, first of all, especially thank Dr. Rivers and Dr. Horn for putting those presentations together this morning. To me, that is awesome. We had some changes and things, and so they had to put that together very, very last minute. I'm trying to find, where's my presentation? Any idea? It's in... I might need help. Come help me. Oh, here it is. Is this it? Yeah, okay. I see it now. Okay. Oh, why are we... Make the things work the way they're supposed to work.
While they're doing that, I'm just going to say there are 908 pages in the first folio that they had to set, and I think that's like 4 million letters or punctuation marks. So keep that in mind. Absolute craziness.
Okay. I mean, really, it's just pictures, but pictures are fun.
Pictures are fun, yeah. I don't know where it went. I'll let Matt, he's the expert.
Please, sir. Okay, so while that's getting going, I wanted to just start introducing my topic a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about Henry Clay Folger and his wife Emily. They are the ones that are most well known for their collections. And so eventually their collections go into the Folger Library, which is in Washington, D.C. And it's the largest collection of Shakespearean works, but also like various stuff related to Shakespeare, and then also that time period too. And so it's a great collection for us to have available to us. It's in Washington, D.C., which, you wouldn't normally think that the biggest collection of Shakespeare would be in Washington, D.C. I would think it'd be in London or, in England somewhere, certainly. And so that led me to kind of question, well, how does it get here? Why does Henry Clay Folger and his wife want it here? What were their collection goals? I was looking at I want to look at the collectors, that's kind of part of my goal, but then also look at some of their methods, and then ultimately kind of why a library too. And so that's what I'm going to deal with today. So as I mentioned, the library is the largest collection of Shakespeare's works and artifacts in the world. The library is in Washington, D.C., and it lists as their mission to preserve and enhance their collection, make their collection accessible to scholars, and to advance understanding and appreciation of Shakespeare's works. And they do this through various outreach programs and all kinds of stuff. The founders of the library were Henry Clay Folger and his wife, Emily Folger. And they had a huge personal collection. And this started with just their personal love of Shakespeare and their desire to get as much as they could of him. According to Emily, Henry Folger believed that Shakespeare is, quote, one of our best sources, one of the wells from which we Americans draw our national thought, our faith, and our hope. And I think that comes back to those words being so important to everybody. But they're building their personal collection during a period of increased American nationalism and kind of American attempts in the late 1800s, early 1900s, attempts at becoming at showing that being American is something different than other parts of the world. And so this was part of their efforts. So they wanted to keep the collection in the United States. That makes a lot of sense. And they wanted to help build this national pride, this national sentiment, and all of these other parts, ugly or not, of nationalism that were going on at that same time. So Henry Clay Folger was born in 1857. He went to college thank you so much. Here's the library. Here they are. Okay, so he went to college at Amherst. He earned a bachelor's and a master's at Amherst. After he earned his bachelor's, he started working for Standard Oil as a clerk. While he was at Amherst, he made friends with somebody who was part of the Standard Oil conglomerate, and so that helped him out. He went back to school. He went to Columbia and earned his law degree in 1881. So, but he was he's one of those rags to riches kind of stories. One of those guys that built his educational opportunities from almost nothing. As a clerk, he started to work his way up in Standard Oil in the company. He eventually becomes friends with J.D. Rockefeller. They were golfing buddies and colleagues, and so that will, again, just this clerk to golfing with J.D. Rockefeller, right? After Standard Oil got broken up because it was a monopoly, he took over as the president of Standard Oil New York, and then eventually was on the chairman of the board of Standard Oil New York. He died a few years after he retired, very unexpectedly. And then his wife, Emily, continued with the process of making the library happen. His wife was a real partner in this. She wasn't just like following along. She was also a lover of Shakespeare as well. She was born in 1858. She attended Vassar, where she got her bachelor's degree. Then she worked as a teacher, got married, and after she got married, she went back and got her master's degree, which is pretty rare. Usually you got your MRS and you were done, right? But she went back to school and earned her master's. So as mentioned, Folger is going to start building his collection slowly but surely. He was given a complete works when he was a young man, loved it, and then so he's like, I want to start collecting these things. He had an opportunity in 1889 to purchase his first Shakespeare. It was a fourth folio, a 1685 copy of the fourth folio. He purchased it from Bangs and Company, which was an American auction house, and for a little over $100, around $3,000 today. So it's not as cheap as it sounds. But he wasn't very wealthy at that point. Eventually, they never had a whole lot of liquid assets. It was all in Shakespeare stuff. But eventually, he was able to have a lot of wealth. But at this time, he was able to pay it in 4 payments. So they let him pay in 4 installments. Over the next 40 years, he amassed the largest Shakespeare collection, as I've mentioned a couple times. And what was really interesting, there's a couple interesting things about what he did as a collector. First of all, he would buy anything. It didn't matter if it was perfect. It didn't matter if it was complete. He wanted it. And so he bought whatever he could. His interests were in collecting, not in finding the perfect copy. He also wanted to find as many pieces of presumably the same thing as possible. So he bought multiple copies of first folios, second folios, third folios, because he wanted as many copies as he could find. He also didn't want anybody to know really that he was up to this. He was a businessman at heart, and he knew that if people found out that Folger was the guy who was bidding on this and that Folger had this huge collection, that the prices would go up. And so he was very secretive about buying the things that he bought. He did have some friends who were Shakespearean scholars who kind of helped him find the right things, and they had a clue as to what he had. But for the most part, most people had no idea everything that they had. They kept most of it in storage in New York City. And so when scholars knew that he had this or that, they would ask him, can I see this or that? And almost always, if they weren't friends with him, he would say, no, it's in storage. It wasn't because he was nasty or anything like that. It's just they were in storage, and so he wasn't going to get it out for somebody. If it was a friend and a scholar, he usually answered direct questions. So if they would ask, do you have this copy of this? His responses were always yes or no, and he was always honest. But he never he and Emily had a very thorough list of what they had, but he never made that list available until they started building their library. And then finally, as I've mentioned before, he and Emily were true lovers of the works of Shakespeare. They weren't collecting because they were valuable pieces, although obviously they were, but because they loved Shakespeare. They read Shakespeare. They studied Shakespeare. They didn't read from these usually, but they read from more modern printings of them. And they would sit around at night and talk about Shakespeare. And so they were true lovers. They weren't just collecting things like some of my weird collections that I've inherited from this or that person. They really liked these things. So the result of all of this is that at the time of his death, he collected around 200 folios. And you can see the folios there, 82 first folios. At the time of his death, it was over half of those known in existence. They found more since, but at the time of his death, he had a half of the first folios that people knew about. 58 second folios, 24 third, 37 fourth, and also he had quartos and other things as well. And he paid the most for a book anybody had ever paid twice. He paid $100,000 for a first folio in the year 1919, and I did the math, $1.7 million in today's money. So he didn't have much liquid assets, but he was an industrialist. He had money. He just put it all in Shakespeare and in their eventual library. According to reports, he and J.D. Rockefeller were golfing when the news broke about this $100,000 purchase. And Rockefeller's like, hey, I heard you paid a lot of money for a book. And Folger's like, oh, you know how the news exaggerates things. And Rockefeller would know. But, and certainly that happens, but in this case, they did not exaggerate it. And then a few years later, he paid more for another book, and so he broke records again. And so then this leads me to kind of the question, like, why were these things available? Why did they make their way to the United States in the late 1800s, early 1900s? And so every folio has its own story, and obviously I didn't track down every folio story, right? I'm not going to do that. That could be something I'll do when I retire. But and so there are different stories for each, but in general, what this reflects is a huge reversal of fortunes for the aristocracy in Europe. The aristocracy, we think about social class in the United States as something that is liquid. You can become part of the upper class based on how much money you make. You can become part of the lower class based on how much money you make. And you move around through the classes. Most of us identify as middle class, whether we are or not. That's related to this period as well. But regardless, in Europe, social classes were much firmer. You were born into your social class. You were born into the aristocracy, and it did not matter how much money you actually had. The aristocracy made their money on land. They owned the land, they farmed. That was how they made their money. But agricultural prices are not consistent. When times are good, you're making pretty decent money. When times are bad, you're not. And around the 1840s, things got bad for farmers. One of the efforts to help the aristocracy make money was the passage of the Corn Laws in the early 1800s. This is in England. The Corn Laws falsely set the prices of grain higher for domestically produced grain. They increased the tariff on imported grain, and so it made domestically produced grain more desirable, but then also more expensive. And so the aristocracy was doing really well. But in 1846, Parliament reverses the Corn Laws. This is partially because what we start seeing around this time is the rise of a middle class who starts demanding more political power and access. This is around the time of the Industrial Revolution. The middle class is going to make their money not on land, but as in professions, so as doctors and lawyers and things like that, but also as industrialists. And so we have a huge amount of money within the middle class, this growing middle class, and really for the first time we're acknowledging that we have a middle class, and then kind of a decline in power of the aristocracy. They're losing money, the middle class is gaining money, but the aristocracy is still firmly within the aristocracy, and they'll remain so for a considerable period of time. But what we start seeing, again, around 1846 is, and those of you guys who take my class, this is around the Chartist Revolution. This is around the time where the middle and lower classes are demanding the right to vote. They're threatening full-on revolution if they don't get the right to vote. And so England is making slow and steady changes. And it's just enough to prevent an all-out revolution, but not enough to prevent people from marching in the streets every now and then. And so in the United States, we're also experiencing the Industrial Revolution, and the same thing is going on. We have this increasing power of the middle class. The middle class is going to start really in the United States dictating cultural and social norms. That's why if I ask you what social class you're in, chances are you're going to tell me middle class, whether you really are or not, and why you know you're making that decision or not. But it's based on this idea that we all want to emulate the middle class in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So, as I mentioned, members of the aristocracy could have literally no money, but they're still part of the aristocracy. And so what starts happening is the members of the aristocracy are like, we got to find ways to make money, and they just start selling everything off, including the folios, including everything that's not tied down. And some things that are tied down, they sell off too. One of my favorite stories related to this reversal of fortune of the aristocracy is the person who owned the land that Stonehenge was on sold Stonehenge. He was so desperate to have valuable land, valuable crops, that he's like, okay, I'm going to sell this to the highest bidder. In 1919, Stonehenge sold for 6,000 pounds. And luckily, the person who bought it, I can only imagine if Ripley had bought Stonehenge, what would have happened? It would have been brought to the United States, put in Vegas. It would have been like this whole thing, right? Luckily, it was a fellow British person who bought it and then donated it to the Historical Preservation Society, and it remains. But if you're a farmer and you make your money off the land, this is just a pile of rocks, right? And it's not productive land, and so it makes sense from that perspective. So, as I said, during this reversal of fortune, members of the aristocracy start selling things off, and Americans are willing to buy a lot of this stuff. We want to show that we are awesome, and so we start buying all of these things across the United States. And Folger was a important, wealthy, well, would have been wealthy had he not bought all of these things, industrialist. And so he was using his money, taking advantage of the situation, and buying more and more stuff. So in this effort, as I mentioned, Emily was a true partner. She wasn't just, kind of along for the ride. They read Shakespeare together. She loved Shakespeare just as much as him. And after he died, she finished the project, and kept it going during the Great Depression, when projects like that would have gone away. Then let's talk about why a library. So the Folgers had no children. They didn't have anybody that would inherit this when they died. And Folger knew what happens when people inherit something that they don't actually care about, because he took advantage of those things, right? He didn't want his collection split up. He wanted it kept together. And again, it was because they loved the subject, and they knew that they had this, not any folio is the same, and people like to compare them to come up with the best version and the more likely version. And so he had all of that at his disposal. He surrounded himself with intellectuals, Shakespearean scholars, and eventually they convinced the Folgers to put their collection, take it out of storage, and put it somewhere where you can use it, and where you can see it, and where others can see it as well. So now they have to decide on a location. The Folgers they rented an apartment. They never even owned, they rented an apartment in New York City so that they could pay for all these folios. And they initially thought that they would put it in New York. That's where the collection was, that's where it was in storage. But then, as now, prices are high in New York. They were very high then, and it was exceptionally expensive to put it in New York. And so it was a chance trip, a layover on a train in DC, and they had a longer layover. And so they got out of the train station and walked around DC for a little bit, and they said, oh, this makes sense. This is where we need to have it. And so much like building his collection, Folger secretly started buying property very close to the National Archives. They were row houses. He started buying one row house after another. But he didn't tell people what he was buying it for. He didn't tell them it was him who was buying it, but people figured it out. And so the first ones were fairly cheap. The last ones, much more expensive, kind of proving his point that you need to keep these a secret. They broke ground for the new library in 1930. Henry never saw its completion. He died 2 months after groundbreaking. He had he had surgery and died really suddenly. And so Emily continued this. This is at the start of the Great Depression, as I mentioned, and lots of these types of projects are stopped unless they were public works projects that come a little bit later, but we don't have that in 1930. That comes in 1933, 1934. And so Emily continued to fund it and helped with its completion. The library opened in 1932. So among its various collections, we have the Elizabethan Theater here that functions as a place where people do lectures, but also plays and things like that. And the core of the collection, of course, is Shakespeare's works, but mostly collected by the Folgers. There are also edited versions of Shakespeare's work from the 18th and 19th century. And then there's other collections, including texts from the Protestant Reformation, some stuff from Luther, some stuff from Calvin, and then texts on the Fronde Revolt, which seemed really, really random that they have texts on the Fronde Revolt there. That's before the French Revolution and Louis XIV. And so I thought that was really kind of random. Performance history, artwork, all kinds of other things. So if you are looking for more information, I got a lot of the information for today from the Folger Institute itself. They also have a podcast if you don't feel like reading. And then various books and journals. This one is one that I used a lot too, The Millionaire and the Bard. Questions, thoughts, comments, stories, limericks?
So as part of this, so if you look at immigration into the country in the 1880s forward, the 1920s, I mean, a lot of that's Central and Eastern European.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is this part of this sort of projecting a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant past that brings forward into the American future, if you will?
Almost certainly, yeah. And you know, in the United States, we and I say we, that's not fair, white Americans of European descent were more likely to look towards Western Europe than any other parts of Europe. In fact, we, as a nation, put legal preventatives in place for people from undesirable locations to come into the United States. Right around this time, all that stuff is going on. And so, yeah, that's part of Folger's kind of, he's part of us, we're part of him, and this is our history too. Yeah.
And it was also very common for immigrant families, especially poor immigrants, to have cheap quarto copies of Shakespeare. So one of the most, there were two books that were most commonly found in American households in the 19th century, and that was the Bible and Hamlet. And if it wasn't Hamlet, then it was something else. But you can trace old family libraries, and there's almost always Shakespeare. That the immigrants who helped found Manifest Destiny rooted themselves in Shakespeare. And so Folger's collection does embody that sense of industrialism and inspiration and imagination and hope.
I didn't know that. Thank you. Well, thank you guys. I'm thrilled that we were able to bring Bard at Blount back. It's been a few years since we've been able to do it in person, and so I'm glad and I'm inspired by my colleagues. Thank you so much.